In 1917, 3 years into the First World War, the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, said he wanted Jerusalem for Christmas. And that is exactly what he got. On December the 11th, General Edmund Allenby pushed aside the Turks, allies of the Germans, and marched into the city along this road. Lawrence of Arabia was by his side. The British public, weary of the horrors of the Western Front, hailed it as a triumph. For the first time since the Crusaders were thrown out by the Muslim leader Saladin 700 years before, Jerusalem was in Christian hands. Now it seemed that Palestine's population of Muslims, Jews, and Christians could be gently guided to live in harmony by the greatest empire in the world, the benevolent British. And yet, it didn't quite turn out like that. The British stand accused of the treacherous betrayal and ruthless repression of the Arab cause. The decisions made by the British rulers of Palestine 90 years ago are held to blame for intensifying a conflict between the West and Islam that continues to this day. When the British first arrived in Palestine, it was the support of the Arabs that concerned them. In an attempt to set up a second front against the Germans in the First World War, in 1916, the British government sent a young intelligence operative from its Arab bureau in Cairo to act as liaison with the Arabs. His name was T.E. Lawrence. To Lawrence and his superiors, Arab and British interests seemed to coincide. The British needed Arab help against the Turkish and German alliance, and the Arabs wanted the British to join their fight for independence from Turkish rule. But the British establishment was split, and there were some who argued that an alliance with the Arabs might prove more trouble than it was worth. Among the managers of the British Empire in London, there had always been a distrust of Islam. There was a widespread view that Muslims were fanatics, prone to holy war, unwilling to subject themselves to the civilizing British. There were bitter memories of the mutinous uprising in India 60 years before. And they remembered Sudan a few years later, when disaster struck again. The forces of the Mahdi, a fundamentalist Muslim, had murdered the great Christian hero, General Gordon. Indeed, the memories of Christian conflict with Islam in the Middle East went back even further. 700 years. This is Carrack Castle in southern Jordan. It was built by the Knights Templar to defend the Holy Land against the Muslim forces of Saracen in the 13th century. It wasn't hard for the British to imagine a Palestine campaign fought across this same piece of desert as an inevitable clash of civilizations, and the Middle East as another crusade in a holy war. But where others saw a clash of cultures, Lawrence saw only the benefits of working with the Arabs. He dreamt of an empire united under one Arab ruler, a force for peace in the Middle East. On the map he created, this stretched from Saudi Arabia through Jordan and Palestine and on to Syria.
I meant to make a new nation, to restore a lost influence, to give 20 million people the foundations on which to build an inspired dream palace of their national thoughts.
Lawrence's optimism found a ready audience among Arabs seeking to liberate their land from the Turks. This is Fawaz Abu Tayyeh. His grandfather was one of Prince Faisal Hussein's military commanders and fought alongside Lawrence.
He went to meet Faisal and Lawrence was there. He never met Lawrence before. He met him first time at Prince Faisal's tent. And Faisal introduced Lawrence to my grandfather, Auda, and he said, this is our friend from the British Army. And the chemistry just worked. Lawrence was trusted by my grandfather. He used to admire him, and the Bedou in general, they used to admire him and to trust him.
The mutual trust between Lawrence and Auda was backed by guarantees from the Arab Bureau in Cairo. The Egyptian High Commissioner wrote,
Great Britain is prepared to recognize and uphold the independence of the Arabs in all the regions lying within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif of Mecca.
This is what we understood. In the name of His Majesty, the King of Great Britain, we promise Arabs to be one unified country under King Hussein, the Grand Sharif of Mecca.
People believed in these promises. They believed that the British government will actually help liberate the Arabs, provide them with a national state, that something will come about.
It was on the basis of this promise of independence that the Arabs prepared to fight alongside the British against the Turks.
There was a tremendous belief that the British will keep their word. But the British had some other ideas.
On January the 2nd, 1916, just 2 months after the British government had issued its guarantees of Arab independence, an agent of the French government came to London for a secret meeting. His name was François-Georges Picot. For 3 days, he held meetings with the British government's representative, Sir Mark Sykes, 6th Baronet. They planned to divide up the Middle East between them in anticipation of an Allied victory in the war. The French would get Syria, and the British a mandate to rule over Palestine. Arabia was to remain divided. There was to be no Arab state united under one ruler. Yet no one told this to the Arabs. Although Lawrence knew that the promise of Arab independence was, in his words, a dead letter, for 2 years he fought through this land with the Arab armies as they continued to lose thousands of men.
And the victims and the martyrs we paid, so many people got killed from my own family, from my tribe, from my people.
As Lawrence wrote at the time,
"We are calling them to fight for us on a lie, and I cannot stand it."
Lawrence felt ashamed of his own country. It was the imperial statesmen like Winston Churchill who deceived Arabs. He lied to them. It wasn't Lawrence.
To the Arabs, Britain had broken an agreement and put imperial interest before honor. The cause of Arab nationalism had been betrayed.
ظهروا ليبيحوا بلاد الحرمين فتصبح حمى مستباح بابات الأمريكيين.
As I speak, the wounds are yet to heal from the Crusader wars of the last century against the Islamic world, or from the Sykes-Picot Agreement between France and Britain, which brought about the dissection of the Islamic world into fragments.
The British betrayal of the Arab cause has not been forgotten. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement wasn't the end of the treachery in Arab eyes. A year and a half later, the British government planned another act of imperial self-interest, one that would change the face of Palestine forever. Schools in the West Bank of Palestine, like this one in Ramallah, give children history lessons in British imperialism. The students are learning about a policy initiative by the British government, which is taught as the defining moment in Palestinian history.
يعطي هذا الوطن لشعب ما بيستحقه أصلا، ولأنه هو تجاهل كل الشعب الموجود في هذه الأرض وما اعترف بحقوقه.
وكمان هذا أتوقع هذا الوعد هو السبب في بكل قضية فلسطين، هو اللي كان السبب في معاناة الشعب الفلسطيني.
The policy initiative was the work of Lord Arthur Balfour, Britain's Foreign Secretary during the First World War. This is the church on his Scottish estate. Inside, on the wall, an epitaph reads that Balfour enriched the realms of thought and advanced truth, righteousness, and peace in the world. Balfour's most remembered act would lead to the creation of the State of Israel and decades of conflict. On December the 2nd, 1917, there was a huge celebration at Covent Garden Opera House. The banker, Walter Rothschild, told the excited audience that this was
the greatest event that has occurred in Jewish history for the last 1800 years.
Rothschild was referring to the Balfour Declaration's promise of British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for all Jews. This was the dream of the Zionist movement. After 1800 years, it seemed that their historical claims to the Holy Land were to be realized. The Jews, thanks to the British, would be going home.
The Zionist movement was a European movement. I mean, those people spoke the same language. They came from the same culture. They were more sophisticated. They knew how to move and to which people to speak. and how to negotiate with the British elite and other elites in the world.
The leader of the Zionist movement, Chaim Weizmann, had managed to convince key members of the British establishment to help him. Some, like Balfour, were anti-Semites who believed a Jewish state would helpfully rid Europe of Jews. The Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, believed the Jews would be a powerful economic ally and that a Jewish nation would be a stabilizing force in the Middle East.
The government came to the conclusion that it was very vital that we should secure the sympathy and cooperation of that most remarkable community, the Jews, throughout the world.
Just 2 months after the Balfour Declaration, the British realized the first part of their pledge to create a Jewish nation. General Edmund Allenby's army swept aside the Turkish forces and conquered Palestine. Yet this was, despite appearances, no simple triumph of an invading army. When Allenby marched into the city, it was the summit of military achievement. To capture Jerusalem must have been the fantasy of any general. This was the holiest of capitals. A place last entered by a triumphant Christian army during the Crusades against Saracens' Muslim empire 700 years before. The whole event was steeped in symbolism. And as the city was a holy site for 3 religions, it was so sensitive that the ceremonies had to be very carefully choreographed.
The British had to do 2 things at once. On the one hand, to boost the morale of their own people, they had to refer to this as a holy war, as a campaign that had religious connotations. On the other hand, you don't want to upset the Muslims. So what they had to do was they had to play kind of a double game.
And the spin doctor of this propaganda campaign? He was Sir Mark Sykes. As well as a signatory to the Saykes-Picot Agreement and drafter of the Balfour Declaration, Sykes produced propaganda to boost the war effort. This was the film he made to publicize Allenby's crusading victories in Palestine. The British Army liberating the Holy Land.
Sykes was a very clever man, and he wanted to orchestrate the event in such a way that would please the different crowds. And he tries to take Allenby's entrance to Jerusalem and just project it to different audiences, to the Muslims, to the Jews, and of course to the British audience back home.
Mark Sykes lived here at Sledden Hall in the Yorkshire Wolds. Despite the sensitivities of Allenby's victory to the Arabs, for Sykes, the crusading metaphor was instinctive.
This is an Eleanor cross, and it was built in the 1890s as a folly, really, by Sir Tatton Sykes, Sir Mark's father. And Mark Sykes filled all the plaques with figures of friends of his who died in the war. Because of his great interest in the Middle East, he had them all dressed as crusaders. And that's why he is depicted as a crusader standing in his armour, with his beautiful sword, and he's standing on the defeated Saracen, with the city of Jerusalem behind, and the scroll above his head, Laetare Jerusalem, Rejoice Jerusalem. looking out as the sort of proud defender of the faith.
The danger for the government was that Sykes' crusading instincts would go too far. The fear of upsetting Muslim sensitivities was so great that just before Allenby's triumph, the government cracked down on the press by sending this censorship order to Fleet Street editors.
The attention of the press is drawn to the undesirability of publishing any article, paragraph or picture suggesting that military operations against the Turks are in any sense a holy war, a modern crusade, or have anything to do with religious questions.
This went against the grain for Sykes, and the press, with his active encouragement, ignored it. In the British press, the crusading King Richard the Lionheart was seen gazing down at the newly conquered Holy Land. In churches around the country, the bells rang out in celebration.
This was the story of returning back to the land and achieving what Richard Lionheart was not able to achieve, that is conquering Jerusalem.
Working on the challenging principle that the British victory should both inspire Christians but not offend Muslims, Sykes tried in Jerusalem to create a very different picture. So it was that Allenby was ordered by London to enter the city on foot, without flying any flags. He appeared to onlookers more as a humble pilgrim than a conqueror. And remarkably, the local people were asked to believe that Allenby's arrival in the city had been prophesied. The British propagandists realized that almost miraculously, Allenby's name, when written in Arabic, spelled Al-Nebi, that is, the prophet. And that was how the British presented a Christian general to the Muslim population of the city. Allenby was, as prophesied, their savior. Yet even in Jerusalem, the attempt to downplay Christian symbolism wasn't completely successful. Within hours of arriving, Allenby addressed local dignitaries.
This was a gathering of the notables of the city, Muslim, Christians and Jews, having to sit below, actually stand or sit below, the new conqueror, the new occupier of the city, who promised them that this would be the beginning of a new era of Christian rule in Jerusalem.
The speech was co-written by Mark Sykes. Here he is standing just behind Allenby at the ceremony. Allenby spoke of his conquest of Jerusalem marking the end of the Crusades. But some Muslims thought he had said it was the beginning of a new Christian era for the city.
They were afraid that actually with this message Allenby was conveying something totally different, that 400 or 500 years of Muslim rule would come to an end and would be replaced what for them would be infidel rule.
On hearing Allenby's speech, the Muslim leaders gathered their delegation and walked off. In the end, there was no disguising the victor's religious credentials. By entering Jerusalem, Allenby was making real what so many at home already believed. The Holy Land was part of England.
There's been a whole tradition of taking this imagery and just imagining England itself as a sort of a holy land, a promised land. And of course, with Sunday school culture, with the endless hymns and sermons that taught children about the geography of Palestine, nothing was more natural than to take these images and think about them as their own childhood. So of course, the idea that now England could own the promised land was a very intriguing one.
But if the Holy Land was so English, why, quite apart from their political aims, should devout believers like Balfour and Lloyd George hand this holiest of Christian sites to the Jews? Quite simply, they believed the Bible decreed it. With Jerusalem already secured, Allenby fought the final victorious battle of his Palestine campaign, here on the plain of Esdraelon. As a student of military history and a devout Christian, he would have known that the Bible prophesies this place as the future setting for the greatest battle of them all. Armageddon.
Where does that word Armageddon come from?
Today, many visitors to the religious sites of the Holy Land are Christian Zionists, Christians who believe in the biblical prophecy of Christ's reappearance as the Battle of Armageddon is being fought.
The Bible says that the Lord will supernaturally return from heaven and that He will fight for Israel.
But Christ's reappearance depends on the fulfillment of one essential condition. First, the Jews have to return to their homeland. In early 20th century Britain, Balfour and Lloyd George were part of this same religious tradition. They too had been steeped in Zionism and believed in the biblical prophecy of the Jews' homecoming. Lloyd George spoke candidly about the Balfour Declaration's origins.
As you might remember, we've been trained even more in Hebrew history than the history of our own country. On Sunday in our Sunday schools, we were thoroughly versed in the history of the Hebrews. We had all that in our minds, so that the appeal came to sympathetic and educated and, on that question, intelligent hearts.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
For Lloyd George, Balfour and others, Sunday school faith and an understanding of biblical prophecy mixed seamlessly with political necessity.
For Lloyd George, the sense of closure, the sense of poetic justice in a way, the idea that the Jews could once again be restored here, this was crucial to the declaration. Of course, there were all these strategic, political, even commercial interests, but the religious question was always there in the background.
People like Balfour and others in the government at that time believed, wholeheartedly that this country belongs to the Jews. They thought that the Zionists could help them more in some places than the Arabs.
From military conquerors to colonial masters, the British would now govern Palestine as keepers of this version of religious history and encourage the Jews to return home. If If this meant ignoring the nationalist ambitions of Palestinian Arabs, so be it. In stark contrast to the earlier guarantees of Arab independence brokered by Lawrence, Balfour made the British agenda crystal clear.
In Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of 700,000 Arabs, who now inhabit that ancient land.
Here you have these people who are professors in Cambridge and in Oxford and at the Sorbonne, and they didn't know any Arabs. They haven't, as far as they were concerned, they were more or less savages who were living in the desert.
A Jewish state would exist in name only unless there were more Jews and more land for them. The British recognized this and encouraged the Zionist movement to speed up immigration and the new settlers to buy land from the Arabs. During the second decade of British rule, more than 250,000 Jews settled in Palestine. The British pretended, and some believed, that the establishment of a national home for the Jews could happen without hurting the Arabs. But of course, how could it?
There were many options for the British. They didn't choose the right ones. And maybe it's easier for me to say it in hindsight, but there were options they didn't choose. And these options would have undoubtedly benefited the indigenous population of Palestine and would have disadvantaged the Jewish community. But they haven't taken these decisions. They took decisions that basically benefited the Zionist project and proved to be catastrophic.
The British did good things in Palestine. They built roads and schools and developed a modern economy. But once they had declared their support for a Jewish state and at the same time promised to protect Arab rights, they were passengers in a car crash.
I think they trapped themselves into this conflict. They put themselves in the middle when they promised one side something and they promised the other side something which is contradicting. And then whenever they tried to balance one step that they made, then the other side will be angry and vice versa.
With Arabs outnumbering Jews by 10-1 in Palestine, the implementation of the Balfour Declaration would inevitably mean the displacement of many thousands of Arab families. This would create a lasting desire for revenge. These men are members of the Palestinian militia, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Their leader, Zakaria Zubeidi, heads Israel's most wanted list.
وعد بلفور هو وعد الدمار للشعب الفلسطيني. وعد بلفور وعد الإسرائيليين بإقامة الدولة الفلسطينية، بإقامة الدولة الإسرائيلية على أرض لم يمتلك ما كانتش ملك للبريطان ولا ملك للأوروبيين. وعد بلفور سطو على شعب فلسطيني على أراضي فلسطينية وطرد فلسطينيين من أرضهم واستيطان إسرائيليين مكانهم. كل قضية الشعب الفلسطيني بده يتحمل مسؤوليتها، بيتحمل مسؤوليتها البريطاني.
Why are the Palestinians dehumanized? Why have they become the naughty boy of the world? Why are the Palestinians in camps? In Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Iraq, in Egypt. Okay, why are they in camps? Because of the Bלفور Declaration.
Salim Tamari is director of the Institute for Jerusalem Studies, but he isn't able to travel to Jerusalem from Ramallah in the West Bank because the Israeli government has literally blocked the road.
All over the western part of the West Bank are lands which has been gulped and taken over under the excuse of building a security wall preventing terrorism. So most people here see through this wall as an attempt to grab more land from the West Bank. And the purpose of this demonstration, which happens every week, every Friday, is to assert this.
The demonstrators believe that the root cause of this conflict lies in the failure of British policy.
It definitely started the Bלفور Declaration before they started the mandate in 1922. And once the British had decided that they should support a separate entity in Palestine, one for the Arabs and one for the Jews, the basis of the territorial conflict began. In those days, of course, the Palestinian Arabs were the vast majority of this country, and most of the supporters of the Zionist project were Europeans coming from abroad. So they actually implanted the seeds of this conflict.
Today, Britain's imperial history in Palestine continues to be exploited by enemies of the West.
Following World War I, which ended more than 83 years ago, the entire Islamic world has fallen under the Crusader banners. They divided the whole world, and Palestine was occupied by the British. Since then, our brothers and sons have been badly tortured in Palestine. We aren't really terrorists in the way they want to define the term. This is a reaction from young men against the violations of the British government.
The promised land had, by a stroke of a pen, become twice promised by the British. Once to the Arabs and once to the Jews. But only one promise would be kept. This was to be the modus operandi of the British mandate in Palestine. And it would lead only to trouble. The intractable difficulties faced by the British trying to reconcile Jewish and Muslim interests are symbolized here. The Western or Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. The argument has remained the same for centuries. Jews see the wall as part of the destroyed Second Temple, where they have prayed since the Middle Ages. For them, the wall is the most sacred site in the world. Muslims see it as the place where the Prophet Muhammad tied his horse before setting off on his night journey to heaven. For hundreds of years, both religions worshipped here. But in 1929, an argument about access to the wall spilled over into violence. The first to feel the impact of the violence was the Jewish community in Hebron. Today, the Jews who live here are closely protected by the Israeli Defense Force and cut off from their Arab neighbors. The house where Miriam Castell was brought up is now out of reach on the Palestinian side of an army checkpoint.
It's exactly my house. In front. It's exactly my house in my left hand. I can't touch it. Can't touch it. Oh, sorry.
The community is divided now, but when Miriam was 4 years old, Jews and Arabs lived side by side.
ופה למטה היה סנדלר יהודי.
There was a shoemaker.
חייט יהודי.
A tailor.
נגר יהודי.
A carpenter.
All these shops down were of Jews, and the Jews were living here.
At the beginning of the 1900s, relationships between the Jews and the Arabs in Hebron was relatively good. There were Arabs that spoke Yiddish, there were Arabs that spoke Ladino, and there were Jews that spoke Arabic. And they lived like neighbors, they all lived together. There wasn't one community, another community, everybody all lived together.
Then, on the night of August the 24th, 1929, this all changed. With the British authorities failing to respond to warning signs of Arab unrest, Arab thugs went round these houses one by one, killing any Jews they could find.
All of a sudden, rocks started flying through the windows. She said it's a miracle that nobody was hurt. So the mother took her and her baby brother and pushed them under the bed, on the floor, so that they would be hidden and they wouldn't be harmed. The family basically split up, and then she went with her uncle to a warehouse and they hid, and her father and her mother and her brother went to another place and they also hid.
By the end of the night, 67 Jews had been killed.
When they were walking in the Jewish quarter, an Arab came in front of them, im cherev.
The sword.
With a sword, a big sword, and my mother said, that's all, we are finished. He was a butcher, so he says, you will not stay here, I will take you in my shop. So he took us and hid us inside the shop. Inside the shop were the meats, איפה שהבגרים היו תלויים שם.
Where all of the meat was all hanging. So he saved you.
He saved me, yes.
Miriam survived, but like the other Jews of Hebron, she blames the British.
It's very, very clear that the British had an agenda. And we know that they cultivated relationships with the Arabs. We know that they closed their eyes and ignored, not only in the 1920s, but later in the 1940s, the same thing happened again and again, where Jews were attacked and the British closed their eyes. And, and unfortunately, they had a tremendous amount of responsibility as then the sovereign power here that was supposed to, of course, take care of law and order.
While the Jews held the British accountable for Arab violence, the Arabs blamed the British for the loss of their land. Increasingly, sporadic incidents of violence were replaced by organized resistance to British rule. As in recent years, the political struggle over land had taken on a new and deadly religious dimension.
We are at the graveyard in which the most important tomb is that of Ezzadin Qassam, the leader of the Palestinian guerrilla movement of the 1930s who fought against the British, and whose name now is the name of the main military wing of the Hamas. And it's also the name of the missiles which are being fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel. This was where he used to preach what we would call today probably political Islam or Islamic fundamentalism. That the only way of pushing forward national ambitions such as independence and self-determination or the eviction of the British and the Zionists could only be through the Islamizing of the society.
For al-Qassam, there could be no separation of politics and religion. He called for a jihad, a holy war against the British. As Arab insurrection against their rule escalated through the 1930s, the British were forced to call in experts in counter-terrorism. The wall that snakes through Palestine, dividing Jew from Arab, was the brainchild of Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in the 1980s, and was designed to keep Palestinian terrorists out of Israel. But the Israelis were not the first to build a defensive wall. In 1936, the British sent their greatest anti-terrorist expert to Palestine. Sir Charles Teggart, known as the strong man of Bengal because of his ruthless suppression of Indian nationalism, had the idea of erecting an anti-terrorist barrier along the borders of Palestine. These are Teggart's own drawings, showing exact details of the fence's construction. He also built dozens of concrete guard posts. He imported attack dogs from South Africa and established a center in Jerusalem to train interrogators. The death sentence began to be meted out. Then, Teggart was joined by another of the British Empire's hard men, Orde Wingate. Wingate was another committed Christian Zionist. From his arrival in 1936, he saw his part in the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine as being a religious duty and the literal fulfillment of Christian prophecy.
A British officer impassioned by the Zionist cause, Captain Orde Wingate, offers to teach the Jewish settlers how to organize themselves for fighting. He teaches them one strategy: to defend yourself, resist, to survive, attack.
Wingate set up special night squads made up of British and Jewish soldiers. Every night, groups of 8 to 20 men would patrol and set ambushes near Arab villages. This was to be a private army to counter terrorism with its own. Wingate is remembered today as a founding father of the Israeli Defense Force.
He has the most important place, I think, in the pantheon of Israeli heroism. This person really pushed forward the military power of the Zionist settlement towards collective actions against the rural community. And most of the Palestinians were living in rural communities.
The British want peace at any price. They try to restore order, search everybody. They act as if both sides are equally guilty. And in fact, British administration retreats from objectivity a little more with each Arab act of violence.
For some politicians, the escalation of violence came as no surprise. As Winston Churchill asked,
"Can it be expected that the Arabs would stand by impassively and watch the building up with Jewish capital and resources of a Jewish army equipped with the most deadly weapons of war until it was strong enough not to be afraid of them?"
ضربنا 6 أشهر رحنا هناك مشان يمنعوا البيع الأرض ومشان والأرض والهجرة يمنعوها. ما استجابوش إنا أبدا قط من الإنجليز. إحنا صرنا ضد الإنجليز بعد خرجنا عن العصيان المدني إلى جماعة مقاتلين. فهمتي؟
Bashir Ibrahim is 100 years old now. In 1936, he joined the Arab revolt against the British.
نروح ناخذ هذول المواصير ونروح بالليل فهمتي من الطرق هاي اللي بنوكها الجيش نيجي نكحف من هون ومن هون ونحطهم فهمتي وني يبقى.
كان معكم سلاح ولا بس ألغام؟
سلاح كيف بس ألغام؟ يبقوا من هون 10 مسلحين من 10 مسلحين مشان لما السيارة اللي ينجى واحد أو السيارة تكلي بيظل يرشوهم.
Demolishing the homes of Arab civilians, shooting handcuffed prisoners, forcing local Arabs to test areas where mines may have been planted. These sound like the sort of accusations made by Arabs today about Israel's recent military actions. In fact, they are descriptions from official British documents of the methods used by the British authorities to combat Arab terrorism.
عاملونا معاملة ما واحد عاملها في الأرض في الظلم القتل والذبح دواما. انت شايفين مش اليوم في قتل وذبح؟ ها مش فيه؟ ها هذا ولا شيء بجانب هذا.
But as the deaths of British soldiers and policemen increased, there was little sympathy from the government for the Arab protests. As Lord Dufferin remarked from the Colonial Office,
British lives are being lost, and I don't think that we, from the security of Whitehall, can protest squeamishly about measures taken by the men in the front line.
By the Second World War, Britain had more trouble on its hands. While millions of Jews were being murdered by the Nazis in Europe, in Palestine, they felt that the British were not hard-nosed enough in their support for a Jewish nation. They too turned to terrorism. As the spiral of violence continued, the British ended up fighting two enemies. The British public, their politicians, and now even the army had had enough. The chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, summed up their exasperation.
The problem of Palestine is exactly the same as the problem of Ireland, namely, Two peoples living in a small country, hating each other like hell.
For Wilson, there was only one way out.
A turning point in history for the people of Palestine, the Promised Land. The last British troops are leaving.
He demanded that the British abandon Palestine. And in 1948, they did.
The Union flag is hauled down and the doors are closed for good on the British mandate.
Most of the graves here are of British soldiers and policemen, killed by both Arabs and Jews in the outbreaks of violence that were regular features of British rule in Palestine. When Allenby marched into Jerusalem in 1917, the British believed they were the heaven-sent guardians of the Holy Land. Yet for 30 years, they faced the simultaneous claims of two competing national movements. It was in the disastrous attempt to broker this clash between Arabs and Jews that the bloody modern history of Palestine was born.
There is a sense of a power that invests in infrastructure, in institutions, definitely leaves something behind that you could almost say that you are thankful for. But especially from the Palestinian side, since this construction came with such destruction, half of Palestine's population was cleansed. Half of Palestine towns were gone. Not because the British did it, but because the British, at least in the Palestinian narrative, allowed it. You can see how the positive elements in the balance sheet pale in comparison, I think, to the negative one.
Today, the negative memories of Britain's mandate in Palestine continue to be exploited for political ends. Bin Laden and others portray the Arab revolt against the British as part of a centuries-old struggle between Islam and Christianity.
I believe that there is a basic clash of civilizations and a clash of values between the world of Islam and the world of the West. We should recognize that it exists. And once we recognize that it exists, we can understand the reasons behind it and know how to combat it.